Sometimes what kills you isn't what the doctors are paid to look for. While 12 of America's sharpest medical minds failed to save Julian Thorne, the most dangerous man on the East Coast, from dying in his $5 million hospital suite, the invisible woman mopping their floors saw exactly what they missed. Evelyn Hartwell breathed in the air of the VIP room and smelled something metallic beneath the expensive cologne, her gaze locking onto the faint yellow tint of his fingernails and the telling pattern of hair loss that the experts had ignored. In a heartbeat, the answer formed in her mind with terrifying clarity. Thallium. The man everyone feared was being murdered by the one person he trusted most, but who would believe a janitor over a team of Harvard specialists? No one. That was the cold, hard reality. ***. Evelyn lowered her gaze as a nurse bustled in to check the monitors, the white rubber soles of the woman's shoes squeaking against the polished floor. To the medical staff, Evelyn was nothing more than a ghost in a pale blue uniform, a piece of moving furniture that kept the sterility of the room intact while they performed the important work of saving lives. She pushed her mop bucket toward the corner, the wheels wobbling slightly, a stark contrast to the $5,000 Italian leather desk chairs that lined the wall. Her own shoes were black non-slip sneakers held together by duct tape along the sole to keep the dirty water from seeping into her socks, a secret humiliation she hid beneath the hem of her trousers. The room smelled of lavender disinfectant and the sharp, coppery scent of sweat that leaked from Julian Thorne's pores, a scent that triggered a memory from a toxicology textbook she had not opened in 5 years. She moved closer to the bed under the pretense of wiping down the side table, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Julian Thorne looked nothing like the terrifying kingpin who supposedly controlled the docks and the unions with a single whisper. His skin was the color of old parchment, damp and gray, stretching tight over cheekbones that looked sharp enough to cut glass. He was 36 years old, but looked 20 years older in this light, his body ravaged by a fire no one else could see. Evelyn squeezed the rag in her hand, her eyes darting to his hands, which rusted limp atop the crisp white sheets. There they were, undeniable and screaming to be seen. Me's lines. The transverse white bands crossing his fingernails were not a symptom of the autoimmune disorder Dr. Blake was currently treating him for. They were the hallmark of heavy metal toxicity. She glanced at the pillow beneath his head, noting the clumps of dark hair that had detached from the scalp, not in the diffuse pattern of stress, but in the patchy, ragged fallout of poisoning. The chart hung at the foot of the bed, a clipboard of metal and plastic that held the secrets of his failing body. Evelyn knew she should not touch it, knew that getting caught reading patient files was immediate grounds for termination, but the burning need to know outweighed the fear. She waited until the nurse turned her back to adjust the Ford drip, then stepped silently to the foot of the bed. Her eyes scanned the medical jargon with the hunger of a starving woman, absorbing the blood work results in seconds. Negative for bacterial infection. Negative for viral load. Liver enzymes through the roof. Peripheral neuropathy. They were treating him for Guillain-Barré syndrome, pumping him full of steroids and plasma that were doing absolutely nothing to stop the thallium sulfate from dissolving his nervous system. They were looking for a disease when they should have been looking for a murderer. A vibration in her pocket shattered her concentration, and she flinched, quickly stepping back from the chart just as the nurse turned around. Evelyn kept her head down, feigning intense interest in a smudge on the floor tile, and waited until the nurse left the room before pulling her phone out. The screen lit up with a text message from Chloe. "Registrar just called. They need the tuition payment by Friday or they drop my classes. I'm sorry, Evie. I don't know what to do." The words felt like a physical blow to the stomach, sucking the air from her lungs. This job was the only thing standing between her sister and a future as bleak as Evelyn's own. If she spoke up, if she dared to question the chief of medicine, she would be fired before she could finish the sentence. She needed this paycheck more than she needed air. Yet, as she shoved the phone back into her pocket, Her gaze drifted back to the man in the bed. Julian Thorne shifted in his sleep, a low groan of agony escaping his lips as the nerves in his legs likely fired with phantom pain. He was a criminal, a monster according to the papers, but in this room, he was just a man dying by inches while the people paid to save him fumbled in the dark. Evelyn thought of her parents, of the oath she had never got the chance to take, and felt the cold weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She could not walk out of this room and let him die, not when the answer was staring her in the face. She had to try, even if it cost her everything. Evelyn found Nicole Torres slumped at a small round table in the break room, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee as if it were the only thing tethering her to consciousness. The break room hummed with the low buzz of the vending machine and the distant rattle of gurneys, a sanctuary of exhaustion where the night shift came to hide for 5 precious minutes. Nicole was one of the few people in this glass and steel fortress who offered Evelyn a smile rather than a command, perhaps because she understood the crushing weight of being at the bottom of the hospital's food chain. Evelyn approached the table, her hands twisting nervously in the fabric of her uniform, knowing that what she was about to say could sound like madness. She sat down opposite the nurse, keeping her voice low enough to blend with the hum of the refrigerator. She asked about patient Thorne, specifically about the hair loss and the pain in his feet, trying to guide Nicole toward the realization without revealing the depth of her own knowledge. Nicole sighed, rubbing her temples, and dismissed it as a side effect of the aggressive steroids Dr. Blake had prescribed. When Evelyn pushed harder, mentioning the discoloration of the fingernails, Nicole's expression hardened from fatigue to warning. She told Evelyn that playing doctor was a dangerous game, especially when the patient was a man like Julian Thorne and the doctor in charge was Harrison Blake. The warning was clear and kind, but it built a wall between them that Evelyn could not climb. "Stay in your lane," the silence said. "You clean the floors. Let the gods decide who lives and dies." Rejection from a friend was painful, but silence was a death sentence, so Evelyn forced herself out of the break room and back into the sterile corridors to find someone with the power to act. She spotted Dr. James Chin near the nurses' station, the youngest resident on Blake's team, a man who still carried the nervous energy of someone terrified of making a mistake. He was reviewing charts on a tablet, his brow furrowed in concentration. Evelyn intercepted him before he could retreat into the doctor's lounge, stepping into his path with a boldness she had not felt in 5 years. She didn't waste time with pleasantries or feigned ignorance this time. She spoke the language of their shared trade, listing the symptoms with clinical precision: peripheral neuropathy, alopecia, gastrointestinal distress, and Mies lines on the fingernails. She laid out the case for thallium poisoning as if she were presenting rounds to a room of professors, watching the annoyance in Chen's eyes shift to surprise and then to something that looked dangerously like respect. For 10 seconds, he listened. For 10 seconds, he saw the medical logic that connected the scattered symptoms into a coherent diagnosis. But then the spell broke. Chin blinked, his gaze dropping from her desperate eyes to the embroidered name on her pale blue uniform, and then down to the scuffed sneakers held together with duct tape. The hierarchy of the hospital reasserted itself with crushing force. The fear of Dr. Blake, a man who could end a residency with a single phone call, outweighed the truth standing in front of him. Chin stepped back, his face closing off like a steel shutter. He sneered, asking if she had picked up a medical dictionary from the trash, and told her that mopping floors did not qualify her to second-guess 12 of the finest specialists in the country. He dismissed her with a wave of his hand, walking away without looking back, leaving Evelyn standing alone in the cold, fluorescent-lit hallway. The humiliation burned hotter than the antiseptic air, a familiar shame that settled deep in her chest. Evelyn leaned against the wall, her shadow stretching long and thin across the linoleum, feeling the ghost of the life she used to have. 5 years ago, she had been the one wearing the white coat, a top-tier medical student with a scholarship and a future that stretched out like a golden road. Then came the screech of tires on a rainy highway, the crushing metal, and the silence that followed. In a single night, she had lost her parents, her home, and her dreams. The debt they left behind was a mountain she could never climb, forcing her to drop out and pick up a mop just to keep a roof over Chloe's head. She was a doctor in her mind, but to the world, she was invisible, a failure who cleaned up the messes of people who are living the life she deserved. She closed her eyes, fighting back the sting of tears, telling herself to walk away, to go back to her cart, to survive. But before she could take a single step, the silence of the night was shattered. A high-pitched, rhythmic alarm screamed from the end of the hall, followed by the frantic shout that every hospital worker dreaded. Code Blue. Room 1. Julian Thorne was dying. The alarm was a physical blow, a rhythmic shrieking that tore through the sterile silence of the ward and sent adrenaline flooding through Evelyn's veins. She didn't weigh the consequences of her next move. She simply ran toward VIP Room 1, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking against the linoleum in a frantic rhythm. By the time she reached the double doors, a swarm of white coats had already descended, a chaotic ballet of panic and shouting. Through the gap in the bodies, she saw Julian Thorne. The man who terrified the city was reduced to a thrashing, convulsing figure on the bed, his back arching off the mattress as violent seizures ripped through his muscles. His skin was cyanotic, a terrifying shade of blue-gray that screamed of oxygen deprivation, and his eyes were rolled back into his head. The monitor was a blur of erratic red lines, signaling a heart that was beating itself to death. Dr. Harrison Blake stood at the head of the bed, his face flushed with the stress of losing his prize patient, barking orders that made Evelyn's blood run cold. Ventricular tachycardia. Prepare to shock. Push 1 milligram of epinephrine now. Increase the steroid drip. Evelyn froze in the doorway, her hands gripping the metal frame until her knuckles turned white. Epinephrine. Steroids. They were treating him for an autoimmune collapse or a standard cardiac event, but if his system was saturated with thallium, accelerating his heart rate was like pouring gasoline on a grease fire. They were killing him. The realization hit her with the force of a physical slap. She watched the nurse load the syringe, saw the defibrillator pads charging, and knew that in 30 seconds, Julian Thorne would be dead. The ghost of the medical student she used to be rose up, screaming that an oath to save life mattered more than a paycheck, more than a uniform, more than her own survival. She shoved past a startled orderly, her voice ripping from her throat before she could second-guess herself. Stop. Don't push the epinephrine. You're going to kill him. The room went silent, the kind of absolute, vacuum-sealed silence that follows a gunshot. Every head turned. The nurse with the syringe froze mid-motion. Dr. Blake looked up, his eyes narrowing as he registered the intruder. It wasn't a fellow doctor or a specialist. It was the cleaning woman, breathing hard, her hair escaping her bun, standing in the center of a sterile field. It's Thallium, Evelyn gasped, the words tumbling out in a rush as she pointed at the convulsing man. Look at the alopecia. Look at the Mies lines on his nails. It's acute thallium poisoning. If you push epinephrine, you'll stop his heart permanently. You need Prussian blue. You need to bind the toxin before his kidneys fail completely. She stepped closer, desperate to make them see, desperate to make them look at the patient instead of the chart. Please, just look at his hands. Dr. Blake didn't look at Julian's hands. He looked at Evelyn with a mixture of disbelief and pure, unadulterated rage. His authority, the fragile god complex that held his world together, had just been challenged by a janitor in front of his entire team. The red in his face deepened to a dangerous purple. Who let this woman in here? His voice was a low, dangerous growl that vibrated with menace. You think because you empty the trash you can diagnose a complex neurological case? Get out. Evelyn stood her ground, though her knees were shaking so hard she thought she might collapse. I was a medical student, she pleaded, ignoring the way the other nurses were looking at her like she was insane. "I know what this is. Please, doctor, just order the toxicology screen. If I'm wrong, fire me. But if I'm right and you do nothing, he dies." "Security," Blake roared, cutting off her plea. "Get this trash out of my ICU immediately. And call her supervisor. I want her terminated before she reaches the parking lot." Two burly security guards materialized from the hallway, grabbing Evelyn by the arms with bruising force. They didn't care about her diagnosis. They only cared that the chief of medicine was screaming. As they dragged her backward, Evelyn fought, her heels skidding uselessly on the floor. "He's being poisoned," she screamed, her voice cracking. "Check the heavy metals. Please." The chaos resumed around the bed, the machine beginning to whine again. In the last second before they hauled her through the doors, Julian Thorne's eyes fluttered open. Through the haze of pain and seizure, his gray gaze locked onto hers. It was a look of confusion, of agony, but for a split second, he saw her. He saw the woman fighting for his life when everyone else was just following protocol. Then his eyes rolled back, and the doors swung shut, sealing him in his expensive tomb. Evelyn was dragged down the corridor, her feet barely touching the ground, the stares of patients and visitors burning into her skin like acid. The guards didn't stop until they reached the service elevator, shoving her inside with enough force that she stumbled against the back wall. "Don't come back to this floor, lady," one of them spat, hitting the button for the basement. "You're lucky Dr. Blake doesn't have you arrested." The doors slid closed, trapping her in the metallic box. Evelyn slumped against the rail, her breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. She looked at her trembling hands, the hands that had wanted to heal, the hands that were now empty. She had thrown away her job, her safety, and her sister's tuition money, and for what? Julian Thorne was going to die anyway. She slid down the wall to the dirty metal floor, pulling her knees to her chest, and for the first time in 5 years, she let herself weep for the injustice of a world where the truth didn't matter if you weren't wearing the right clothes to speak it. The red light on the employee entrance scanner did not flash. Evelyn held her breath, her ID badge hovering over the black plastic square, waiting for the harsh fuzz that would announce her termination to the entire lobby. Instead, a cheerful green light blinked, and the lock disengaged with a heavy mechanical thud. It was a clerical error, a lag in the system, or perhaps Nicole had quietly buried the incident report under a stack of paperwork to give her one last night of dignity. Evelyn didn't question the miracle. She simply slipped through the door, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She moved quickly to the locker room, changing into a fresh blue uniform with hands that trembled slightly. This was it. Her last shift. Her last chance to prove that she wasn't crazy, that she wasn't just a bitter dropout hallucinating murder plots in the sterilization of a hospital room. She grabbed her cleaning cart, the wheels rumbling familiarly over the tile, and headed straight for the VIP wing, not to clean, but to hunt. The VIP wing was quiet, the earlier chaos of the code blue settled into a tense, rhythmic vigil. Derek, the lead bodyguard, stood outside room 1 like a stone gargoyle, his eyes scanning the corridor with a suspicion that made Evelyn keep her head low. She parked her cart near the nurse's station, grabbing a bottle of glass cleaner and a microfiber cloth, and began to wipe down the long observation window that looked into the suite. Through the slats of the blinds, she could see Julian Thorne. He was alive, barely. The machines around him hummed a steady, fragile tune, pumping fluids into veins that were slowly collapsing. But Evelyn wasn't looking at Julian. She was watching the man sitting by his bedside, the man the nurses called the Saint of Baltimore for his devotion to his dying friend. Marcus Webb sat with his elbows on his knees, his expensive Italian suit unwrinkled, staring at Julian with an expression of profound sorrow. Or at least, that was what it looked like to the casual observer. Evelyn scrubbed the same spot on the glass for 5 minutes, her eyes narrowing as she dissected the scene with the cold logic of a diagnostician. Marcus was too still. A grieving friend fidgets, paces, checks the monitor, holds the patient's hand. Marcus sat with the patience of a statue. Then he moved. He reached into a leather satchel at his feet and pulled out a small, opaque jar with a silver lid. It looked like high-end cosmetic packaging, innocuous and luxurious. Evelyn watched as Marcus opened the jar, the creamy substance inside gleaming under the dim hospital lights. He flagged down a passing nurse, saying something that made her nod and smile sympathetically. The nurse pulled on a pair of latex gloves, standard protocol, and took the jar, scooping out a generous amount of the thick white lotion. The realization hit Evelyn so hard she almost dropped her spray bottle. The gloves. The nurse was safe because of the gloves. Marcus was safe because he never touched the cream himself. Julian, however, was helpless. Evelyn watched in horror as the nurse began to massage the lotion into Julian's arms and chest, likely believing she was hydrating dry skin caused by the dehydration and fever. It was brilliant. It was evil. Thallium sulfate was tasteless and odorless, but it was also soluble. Dissolved in a lipid-heavy base like a moisturizer, it would bypass the liver's first-pass metabolism and soak directly into the bloodstream through the pores. No wonder the stomach contents were clean. No wonder there was no trace of poison in his food. They were painting death onto his skin every single day, and the medical staff was helping them do it. The nurse finished, peeled off her gloves, and tossed them in the biohazard bin before leaving the room. Marcus remained. He stood up and walked to the bed, looking down at the man he called brother. Evelyn pressed closer to the glass, her breath fogging the surface. The sorrow dropped from Marcus's face like a mask unhooked. In its place was a look of cold, predatory calculation. He didn't look like a man losing his best friend. He looked like a man checking his watch, waiting for a timer to run out. His lips moved, whispering something to the unconscious kingpin, a secret meant only for the dying. A chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning swept down Evelyn's spine. She had the what and the how. Now, staring at the monster in the Armani suit, she had the who. But knowing the truth and proving it were two very different things, and the predator behind the glass looked ready to kill anyone who got in his way. Evelyn retreated to the alcove near the service elevators, the hum of the floor polisher offering a thin veil of cover as she tried to calm the tremors in her hands. She had the who and the how, but without physical evidence, her knowledge was nothing more than a dangerous secret that would get her killed. She was wringing out her mop, the gray water swirling into the bucket like a dark omen, when the heavy oak doors of the VIP suite swung open again. Marcus Webb stepped out, but this time the mask of the grieving brother had slipped entirely, replaced by the impatient scowl of a businessman whose deal was taking too long to close. He paced toward the elevators, his Italian leather shoes clicking sharply on the tile, and pulled a burner phone from his jacket pocket. Evelyn froze, pressing herself into the shadows of the alcove, her breath hitched in her throat as Marcus brought the device to his ear. He didn't look around. Why would he? To men like Marcus Webb, the cleaning staff were no more sentient than the vacuum cleaners they pushed. "He is still holding on," Marcus said, his voice low but carrying clearly in the acoustic quiet of the night shift. "The man is a cockroach. I've doubled the dosage in the lotion, but his heart just won't quit." Evelyn felt a wave of nausea roll through her stomach, the confirmation of her theory hitting her with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't just poisoning Julian, he was impatient that it wasn't happening faster. Marcus listened to the voice on the other end, tapping his foot rhythmically against the floor, a gesture of agitation that betrayed the pressure he was under. "Don't worry about the medical team," he scoffed, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. "Blake is an arrogant fool. He is chasing autoimmune ghosts while I paint death on Julian's skin right under his nose. Give it 2 more days. Once his kidney shut down completely, the territory is ours." Prepare the warehouse shipment for Friday. 2 days. Julian didn't have 2 days. His kidneys were already failing, and if Marcus ramped up the dosage again, the next seizure would be the last. Evelyn's grip on the mop handle tightened until her knuckles turned white, a soft squeak of wood against rubber escaping into the silence. It was a tiny sound, barely a whisper, but in the empty corridor, it was a gunshot. Marcus spun around, the phone snapping shut in his hand, his eyes locking onto Evelyn's figure huddled in the alcove. The blood drained from Evelyn's face as the predator's gaze pinned her to the wall. He didn't run, and he didn't panic. Instead, he slid the phone into his pocket and walked toward her with a slow, deliberate stride that was far more terrifying than a sprint. He stopped inches from her, close enough that the expensive cologne he wore burned her nose, masking the scent of the poison he carried. "You're the one from the other night," Marcus said, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. "The one who likes to play doctor." He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, his fingers digging into the muscle near her neck. It looked like a friendly gesture, a comforting pat from a concerned visitor, but the pressure was agonizing, a silent promise of violence. "You work very hard, don't you? Always cleaning, always listening." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that chilled her blood. "Hospitals are dangerous places, my dear. Slippery floors, sharp instruments, so many accidents waiting to happen. It would be a tragedy if someone as curious as you had a nasty fall." He squeezed harder, watching the pain flash in her eyes, before releasing her abruptly. "Keep your head down and your mouth shut. For your health." The elevator dinged behind him, shattering the tension. Marcus straightened his jacket, flashed her a cold, empty smile, and stepped into the car. As the doors slid shut, hiding his face, Evelyn slumped against the wall, her legs giving out. He knew. He knew she was watching, and he had just given her an expiration date. She couldn't wait for 2 days. She couldn't even wait for morning. She had to steal that lotion tonight. 3 in the morning was the time when souls slipped away, the graveyard hour when the hospital hummed with a quiet, mechanical indifference to life and death. Evelyn stood in the custodial closet 3 doors down from the VIP suite, watching through the crack in the door as the digital clock on the wall flickered past the hour. Her heart beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a stark contrast to the deathly stillness of the corridor. Derek, the immovable object guarding Julian Thorne's door, finally shifted. The giant of a man rubbed his face with a hand the size of a catcher's mitt, groaned softly, and turned toward the nurse's station at the far end of the hall, likely in search of the bitter black coffee that kept him vertical. It was a window of perhaps 60 seconds, a sliver of time that stood between Evelyn and the evidence she needed to save a life or lose her own. She slipped out of the closet, moving not like a cleaner, but like a shadow, her taped-up sneakers making no sound on the polished linoleum as she glided toward the lion's den. The door to room 1 was heavy, swinging open on silent hinges that felt greased with money. Inside, the air was freezing, chilled to a temperature that preserved cut flowers and dying men. The only light came from the blinking LEDs of the life support monitors, casting rhythmic red and green shadows across the walls like a slow-motion rave for the damned. Evelyn held her breath, creeping toward the bedside table where the jar of Swiss lotion sat like a benign grenade. Julian Thorne lay motionless in the center of the bed, the ventilator hissing a steady, artificial breath into his lungs. He looked like a fallen king in a marble tomb, his face gaunt, his skin possessing the translucent pallor of wax. It was terrifying to be this close to him, to the man whose name made hardened criminals in Baltimore lower their voices, but Evelyn forced her hand into her pocket and withdrew the plastic syringe she had fished out of a sterile supply bin earlier that evening. She reached for the jar, her fingers trembling so badly she had to brace her wrist against the edge of the table. Every sound in the room seemed amplified. The hum of the fridge sounded like a jet engine, the rustle of her uniform like a landslide. She twisted the silver lid of the lotion jar, praying it wouldn't squeak. It gave way silently. Evelyn dipped the nozzle of the syringe into the thick, white cream, pulling back on the plunger to draw up a few milliliters of the deadly sludge. Just a little, she told herself, sweat pricking at her hairline despite the arctic chill of the room. Just enough to prove it. She had the sample. She was safe. She began to withdraw the syringe, but in her haste, her elbow knocked against the heavy glass jar. It slid across the polished wood and clicked against a water glass, a sharp, crystal sound that rang through the darkness like a bell. Evelyn froze, her lungs seizing, her eyes darting to the man in the bed. For a second, nothing happened. The ventilator hissed. The monitor beeped. Then, movement exploded from the stillness. A hand shot out from the sheets, not with the weak, trembling coordination of a dying invalid, but with the striking speed of a viper. Julian's fingers clamped around Evelyn's wrist, his grip crushing bone and tendon with a strength that shouldn't have been possible for a man in organ failure. Evelyn gasped, dropping the syringe onto the bed as he yanked her forward, off balance, dragging her down until her face was inches from his. She found herself staring into eyes that were wide open and burning with a terrifying, lucid intensity. There was no sleep in them, only the cold, hard calculation of a killer who had woken up to find an enemy in his perimeter. Julian Thorne didn't look like a victim anymore. He looked like a predator cornered in his own lair. His other hand moved beneath the pillow, likely searching for a weapon that wasn't there, before settling for gripping the front of her uniform, twisting the fabric tight against her throat. "Who sent you?" His voice was a rasp, like gravel grinding on steel, but it carried the undeniable weight of a death sentence. Did Marcus get impatient? Did he send the cleaning girl to finish the job? Evelyn couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, paralyzed by the sheer lethal aura radiating from the man who was supposed to be helpless. She was trapped in the iron grip of a dying kingpin, the syringe lying on the sheets between them, the only proof of her innocence, or the weapon that would condemn her. Evelyn didn't beg, and she didn't scream, even though the hand wrapped around her throat was squeezing the air from her lungs like water from a sponge. Looking into the furious, terrified eyes of the most dangerous man on the East Coast, she realized that pleading would only confirm his suspicion that she was a hard killer caught in the act. Instead, a surge of adrenaline, hot and sharp, burned through her fear, replacing panic with the same cold clarity she used to feel during emergency room rotations. She clawed at his wrist, not to break his grip, but to anchor herself as she forced words past her constricted larynx. "If I wanted you dead," she choked out, her voice raspy but fierce, "I wouldn't be here risking my life to steal lotion. I'd be at home sleeping while you convulsed yourself into cardiac arrest." Julian's eyes narrowed, the gray irises swirling with a storm of violence and confusion, but the pressure on her throat lessened by a fraction of an inch. "I'm not trying to kill you, Mr. Thorne," Evelyn gasped, sucking in a greedy breath of the sterile air. "You're already dead. You're dead because your doctors are treating you for a disease you don't have, and the man sitting by your bedside is painting poison onto your skin every single day." Julian released her abruptly, shoving her backwards so hard she stumbled against the medical cart, instruments clattering to the floor in a cacophony of steel. He fell back against the pillows, his chest heaving with the effort of the assault, sweat beading on his forehead as his body reminded him of its frailty. "You're lying," he whispered, though the certainty in his voice was fracturing. "Marcus is my brother. We grew up on the same streets. He would die for me." Evelyn straightened her uniform, her hand going instinctively to the red marks blossoming on her neck. She picked up the syringe from the bedsheet where it had fallen and held it up like a holy relic. "Look at your hands, Julian," she said, using his first name without permission, stripping away the titles and the fear. "Look at the white lines on your nails. Look at the hair on your pillow. Those aren't symptoms of Guillain-Barré. That is thallium. It's a heavy metal poison, tasteless, odorless, and soluble in fat. Marcus is the only one who touches that jar, the only one who insists you use it. He isn't sitting here watching you recover, he's sitting here watching the clock. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator and the ragged breathing of two people standing on the edge of a precipice. Julian looked at his hands, really looked at them for the first time in weeks, seeing the telltale mies lines that cut across his fingernails like white scars. He looked at the jar of Swiss lotion on the table, the innocent white cream that smelled of expensive botanicals. The denial was strong, built on 15 years of blood and loyalty, but Julian Thorne was a man who survived because he saw the world as it was, not as he wished it to be. He looked back at Evelyn, searching for the deceit, for the greed, for the flicker of a lie. He found only the exhaustion of a woman who had nothing left to lose but the truth. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "You're a cleaner. You're a ghost in this place. Why risk your neck for a man the world calls a monster?" Evelyn stepped closer, the fear finally gone, replaced by a profound sadness that seemed to resonate with the darkness in the room. "Because I know what it feels like to lose everything in a single night," she said softly. "And because betrayal is the worst way to die. It doesn't just kill your body, it kills every memory you ever had of love. You don't deserve to die thinking your brother loves you when he's the one holding the knife." The words hit Julian harder than the poison. He closed his eyes, a flicker of pain crossing his face that had nothing to do with failing kidneys. When he opened them again, the gray was cold, hard, and decisive. He pointed a trembling finger at the syringe in her hand. "Take it," he commanded, the authority of the dawn returning even as his body failed. "Test it. But listen to me carefully, Evelyn Hartwell. If you are wrong, if you are playing a game, my men will find you before you can leave the city. There is no hole deep enough to hide from me. And if I'm right?" Evelyn asked, gripping the syringe so tight the plastic dug into her palm. Julian looked at the ceiling, at the blink-white tiles that had been his view for weeks of agony. "If you're right," he said, his voice turning into a vow that carried more weight than any contract, "then I owe you a life." He waved his hand, a dismissal and a permission in one motion. Evelyn didn't wait for him to change his mind. She shoved the syringe into her pocket, turned on her heel, and slipped out of the room just as Derek's heavy footsteps echoed from the far end of the hallway. She walked fast, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, carrying the weight of an empire's future and her own survival in a few milliliters of stolen cream. $500 for a 24-hour rush. The clerk at the private toxicology lab in the suburbs of Baltimore didn't look up from his magazine, his voice flat and bored, as if he weren't holding the potential for a murder conviction in his grease-stained hands. Evelyn stared at the peeling laminate of the counter, her hand clutching the envelope of cash she had pulled from the shoebox under her bed less than an hour ago. It was $520, every cent she had scraped together from double shifts and skipped meals, money that was destined for the registrar's office at Chloe's college on Monday morning. Without this, Chloe would be kicked out. Her sister would be back to square one, another Hartwell woman failed by a system that demanded money they didn't have. Evelyn looked at the syringe in her pocket, then at the cash, her heart tearing in two. She was gambling her sister's future on the life of a criminal who might execute her anyway. But then she remembered Julian's eyes, the raw betrayal, the human terror beneath the monster's reputation. She couldn't let him die. With a shaking hand, she slid the bills across the counter. "Do it," she whispered, feeling the weight of the sacrifice settle in her gut like lead. The next 48 hours were a blur of adrenaline and paranoia, a waking nightmare where every shadow looked like Marcus Webb and every footstep sounded like an executioner. Evelyn went back to work because she had to, keeping her head down, polishing floors until her arms ached, trying to make herself invisible again. But the hospital felt different now. It was no longer a workplace, but a crime scene. She avoided the VIP wing as much as possible, but when she did pass, She saw the tension radiating from room 1. The nurses whispered that Mr. Thorne was being difficult, refusing his skin treatments, complaining of hypersensitivity. Evelyn knew the truth. Julian was buying time. He was lying there in agony, his nerves firing pain signals with every heartbeat, rejecting the only thing that could ease his dry skin because he now knew it was liquid death. Marcus paced the hallway like a caged tiger, his smooth facade cracking to reveal the violent impatience underneath. He cornered doctors, demanding answers, his eyes darting to the monitors with a hunger that sickened Evelyn. He knew Julian should be dead by now. The poison was in the room, but the victim wasn't taking the bait, and the predator was getting desperate. Then, on the afternoon of the second day, as the sky outside turned a bruised purple with an approaching storm, Evelyn's phone buzzed in her pocket. She dropped her mop in the middle of the cafeteria, ignoring the glare of the supervisor, and pulled the device out with trembling fingers. Results ready. 2 words that changed the world. She didn't clock out. She didn't ask for permission. She simply ran, bursting out of the hospital doors and sprinting to the bus stop, her chest heaving. By the time she reached the lab, the rain had started, a cold, relentless downpour that soaked through her thin jacket in seconds. She slammed her receipt on the counter, snatching the white envelope from the clerk before he could fully extend his arm. She tore it open right there in the lobby, her wet hair plastering to her face, water dripping onto the paper. Her eyes scanned the columns of chemical data until they hit the red text at the bottom. Detected, thallium sulfate. Concentration, lethal. The world tilted on its axis. She was right. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't invisible. She was right. She shoved the paper inside her jacket to protect it from the rain and ran back out into the storm, her sneakers splashing through puddles, running toward the hospital not as a cleaner, but as the only person on Earth who could stop a murder. Rain lashed against the hospital's glass facade, blurring the city lights into streaks of neon and gray as Evelyn burst through the revolving doors. She was a dripping mess of rainwater and determination, her cheap jacket soaked through to the skin, clutching the damp envelope against her chest like a shield. The security guard at the front desk, the same man who had dragged her out by her arms just days before, stood up with a scowl that promised violence. "You," he growled, stepping out from behind his podium, his hand reaching for the radio on his belt. "I told you if I saw your face here again, I'd call the cops." Evelyn didn't stop, didn't flinch, didn't even slow down. She marched straight toward the elevators, her eyes fixed on the steel doors. The guard lunged to grab her, his fingers inches from her arm, when a massive hand clamped down on his shoulder. Derek Sullivan stood there, a mountain of black wool and muscle, looking down at the guard with eyes that held no warmth. "Let her go," Derek said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the tense air. "Mr. Thorne is expecting her." The guard froze, his authority crumbling instantly in the face of the Mafia's reach. Derek nodded at Evelyn, a silent command to move, and she stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding shut on the guard's bewildered face. The silence inside VIP Room 1 was heavy, the air thick with the smell of sickness and the metallic tang of impending death. Julian Thorne lay propped against the pillows, his skin the color of ash, his breathing shallow and ragged. He looked like a man who had nothing left to give, a man whose body had finally surrendered to the invisible fire burning through his nerves. But when Evelyn walked in, dripping rainwater onto the pristine tile, his eyes snapped open. They were sunken and rimmed with red, but the gray iris burned with a terrifying, desperate hope. Evelyn walked to the side of the bed, her hand shaking as she pulled the crumpled, damp report from her jacket. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She simply smoothed the paper out on the tray table, right over the untouched dinner, and pointed to the red text at the bottom. Thallium sulfate. Positive. Julian looked at the paper. He stared at it for a long time, the only sound in the room the rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor. Evelyn watched his face, expecting rage, expecting shouting, but what she saw broke her heart. His expression crumbled. For a split second, the feared kingpin was just a man realizing that his brother, his best friend, the person he loved most in the world, had spent weeks looking him in the eye while slowly murdering him. Then, the heartbreak vanished, replaced by a cold, absolute calm that was far more frightening than any outburst. Julian closed his eyes for a second, inhaled a rattling breath, and when he opened them again, the man was gone. Only the boss remained. He pressed the call button on the side of the bed, holding it down until the nurse's station intercom buzzed. "Get Blake in here," he rasped, his voice sounding like grinding stones. Now. 5 minutes later, the doors swung open and Dr. Harrison Blake strode in, looking annoyed and impeccably groomed, radiating the arrogance of a man whose time was too valuable to be wasted. He stopped short when he saw Evelyn standing by the bed, soaking wet and defiant. "Security," Blake barked, his face flushing red. "I thought I told you to throw this woman out. She is harassing my patient." "Shut up," Julian said. It wasn't a shout, but the command whipped through the room like a lash. Blake's mouth snapped shut, stunned into silence. Julian lifted a trembling hand and pointed to the lab report on the table. "Read it." Blake looked from the patient to the cleaner, then stepped forward, snatching the paper with a sneer. He adjusted his glasses, prepared to dismiss whatever nonsense the maid had cooked up. Evelyn watched the blood drain from his face. It started at his chin and went all the way to his hairline, leaving him looking like a ghost in a white coat. This isn't possible," Blake stammered, his hands shaking. "Thallium?" But the standard screen was negative. "Because you didn't look for it," Evelyn said, her voice steady and hard. "You looked for what was easy. You looked for what you knew." Blake looked at Julian, terror dawning in his eyes as he realized the magnitude of his failure. "We need Prussian blue," Blake whispered, his arrogance gone, replaced by frantic medical urgency. "Immediately. High dose. We have to bind the toxin in the gut before it reabsorbs." He turned and ran to the door, shouting for a nurse, shouting for the pharmacy, finally doing the job he should have done weeks ago. The room quieted as the medical team rushed to prepare the antidote, leaving Julian and Evelyn alone in the eye of the storm. The machines beeped a steady rhythm, marking the seconds of a life that had just been snatched back from the edge. Julian looked at Evelyn, his gaze lingering on her wet hair, her cheap jacket, the fierce determination in her blue eyes. "You are right," he said softly. "I owe you everything." Evelyn shook her head, exhaustion finally hitting her. "You don't owe me anything. Just live." Julian turned his head slowly to look at Derek, who was standing by the door, his hand resting on his holster. The softness vanished from Julian's face, replaced by the shark-like stillness of a predator sensing blood in the water. "Derek," Julian said, his voice void of all emotion. "Call Marcus. Tell him the doctors say it's the end. Tell him I'm fading fast." A cruel, humorless smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Tell him to come say goodbye." The VIP suite was staged for a funeral that hadn't happened yet, the lights dimmed to a respectful twilight, the heart monitor volume lowered to a rhythmic, dying whisper. Evelyn stood in the deepest shadow of the corner, her arms wrapped around herself, watching the tableau with a nausea that had nothing to do with the smell of antiseptic. Julian Thorne lay motionless on the bed, his eyes closed, his chest rising and falling in the shallow, uneven rhythm of a man taking his final breaths. It was a terrifying performance, flawless in its dissection, born from a lifetime of hiding weakness from wolves who would tear him apart at the first sign of blood. Derek stood by the door, his face a mask of stone, and nodded once as the heavy oak door creaked open. Marcus Webb stepped inside, bringing with him the scent of rain and expensive wool, his face arranged in a perfect, practiced expression of devastating grief. He walked to the bedside with heavy steps, ignoring the chair, and stood over the man he had called brother for 30 years. Marcus reached out, his hand hovering over Julian's shoulder before resting there with a weight that looked comforting to an outsider, but felt possessive to Evelyn's watching eyes. "I'm here," Julian Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion, loud enough for Derek to hear by the door. "I'm here. You can let go now. I've got everything handled." He leaned down, bringing his face close to Julian's ear, intimate and brotherly. But Evelyn, pressing herself into the wall, saw the shift. The grief evaporated from Marcus's profile, replaced by a cold, triumphant sneer. He lowered his voice to a whisper that hissed through the quiet room like steam escaping a valve. "Go on, die already. You've held on 2 days too long, you stubborn bastard. The commission is waiting for me to take the chair. Just let go." "You are always impatient, Marcus." The words didn't come from the doorway or the shadows. They came from the pillow. Julian's eyes snapped open, clear and sharp as shattered glass, locking onto Marcus's face inches from his own. The transformation in Marcus was immediate and violent. He recoiled as if he'd been burned, stumbling back against the instrument tray, his face draining of color until he looked more like a corpse than the man in the bed. "Julian," he stammered, his voice cracking. The doctor said, they said you were fading." Julian slowly pushed himself up against the pillows, wincing slightly as his damaged muscles protested, but his gaze never wavered. He reached out and picked up the lab report from the bedside table, holding it up so the red text caught the dim light. "They did say I was fading," Julian said, his voice low and deadly calm. "Until a woman who mops floors told them to look for the poison you've been rubbing into my skin for 3 weeks." Marcus looked at the paper, then at Julian, and finally at Evelyn standing in the corner. The shock on his face curdled into a twisted, ugly rage. The mask of the loyal consigliera shattered completely, revealing the rotting envy that had festered beneath it for decades. "You ungrateful son of a bitch," Marcus spat, straightening his jacket with trembling hands. "I built this empire. While you sat in the big chair drinking scotch and making the easy calls, I was the one in the streets. I was the one breaking kneecaps and burying bodies. And what did I get? I got to be your shadow. I got to be the brother who never gets a seat at the big table." He was screaming now, pacing the small room like a trapped animal, his gestures wild and frantic. "I deserve it, Julian. It belongs to me. You don't even know how to run it anymore. You've gone soft." Julian didn't shout back. He didn't argue. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply watched Marcus unravel with the detached curiosity of a judge watching a guilty man hang himself. When Marcus finally ran out of breath, panting and red-faced in the center of the room, Julian spoke 3 words that carried more weight than a bullet. "Take him away." Derek moved from the door. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. He grabbed Marcus by the back of the neck and the belt, slamming him face first into the wall with a bone-crunching thud. Marcus struggled, shouting threats, shouting pleas, but 2 more men appeared from the hallway, silent and efficient. They dragged the screaming traitor out of the room, his heels skidding on the polished floor, his voice echoing down the corridor until the heavy door clicked shut, severing the sound instantly. Silence rushed back into the room, heavy and suffocating. Evelyn hadn't moved. She was trembling, her eyes wide, staring at the empty space where Marcus had just been standing. She had saved a life, yes, but she had also unleashed a monster. She had just witnessed a death sentence passed without a trial, executed with a terrifying, bureaucratic efficiency. Julian turned his head slowly, his gray eyes finding hers in the shadows. The softness that had been there when he thanked her was gone, replaced by the hard, unforgiving iron of the kingpin. He looked at her, really looked at her, acknowledging the witness to his brutality. "You saved the devil, Evelyn Hartwell," he said softly, his voice echoing in the sudden quiet. "Are you afraid now?" 7 days later, the air in VIP Room 1 no longer smelled of death and antiseptic. It smelled of expensive espresso and the crisp, ozone scent of power being consolidated. Julian Thorne sat in the high-backed leather chair by the window, not the bed, wearing a charcoal robe that cost more than Evelyn's entire year of rent. The gray pallor was gone, replaced by the returning color of a man whose blood was finally his own again, though the lines of exhaustion around his eyes hinted at the toll the poison had taken. Evelyn stood before him, twisting her hands in her lap, feeling strangely out of place without her cleaning cart or her uniform. She had been summoned not by a supervisor, but by Derek, who had escorted her up in the private elevator like a visiting diplomat. Julian didn't waste time with small talk. He reached onto the table and slid a rectangular slip of paper across the mahogany surface until it rested in front of her. It was a check. The signature was wet ink, aggressive and sharp, but the line for the amount was blank. "Name your price," Julian said, his voice regaining the baritone resonance that commanded armies. "A house? A new life? Enough money to disappear to an island where no one knows your name? Write the number, and it's yours." Evelyn looked at the check, at the dizzying potential of that empty line, and then she looked at the man who offered it. To him, the world was a series of transactions, a ledger where debts were paid in blood or cash, and he was uncomfortable owing anyone, especially a woman who scrubbed his floors. She reached out, placed 2 fingers on the paper, and slid it back toward him. "I didn't do it for the money, Julian," she said quietly, holding his gaze despite the predator's intensity that flared in his eyes. "I didn't save a bank account. I saved a human being. If I take this, it becomes a job. It becomes a transaction. And I don't want to be another person on your payroll." Julian stared at her, genuinely perplexed, as if she had just spoken a language he hadn't heard in decades. "Everyone has a price, Evelyn," he countered, though the edge in his voice softened. "You're living in a shoebox apartment. You're eating vending machine dinners. Don't let pride make you stupid." "It's not pride," Evelyn said, her voice firm. "It's dignity. There's a difference." Julian studied her for a long moment, the silence stretching between them, before a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. He reached for a leather folder on the table, flipping it open to reveal a stack of legal documents. "I figured you might say that. You're stubborn. It's an annoying quality, but it saved my life." He turned the folder around. "The Thorne Foundation for Medical Excellence. It's a new initiative I just authorized. Full tuition, living stipend, housing allowance, and a guaranteed residency placement for exceptional students who have faced financial hardship." He tapped the paper with a manicured finger. "You are the first recipient. And your sister Chloe is the second." Evelyn's breath hitched. He had investigated her. He knew about the debt, about the dropout, about the little sister she was drowning to keep afloat. "This isn't charity," Julian added sharply, cutting off her protest before it could form. "This is an investment. I only invest in the best. You have a brain that sees what others miss. Wasting it on mopping floors is an insult to the universe. You will take this, Dr. Hartwell, or I will be very offended." Evelyn looked at the papers, the seal of the foundation gleaming like a promise. It wasn't a payoff, it was a key. It was the future she had mourned for 5 years, handed back to her on a silver platter by the man she had pulled back from the brink. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and fast. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate but sincere. Julian stood up, closing the distance between them. He reached out and took her hand, his skin warm and alive, the grip firm but careful. For a moment, the gap between their worlds, the doctor and the dawn, the healer and the killer, vanished. He looked at her with a fierce intensity, as if memorizing her face. "Go," he said, his voice low and rough. "Get out of here. Go to Harvard. Become the person you were meant to be. My world is dark, Evelyn, and you shine too bright to be stuck in the shadows with me." He squeezed her hand once, a goodbye that felt like a severance, and then released her. "Derek will drive you. Don't look back." Evelyn walked out of the hospital 20 minutes later, the heavy glass doors swinging shut behind her for the last time. The sun had broken through the storm clouds, washing the wet pavement in a blinding, brilliant gold. She wasn't wearing the pale blue uniform. She was wearing her own clothes, her head held high, the folder clutched to her chest. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't a ghost haunting the hallways of other people's lives. She was Evelyn Hartwell, future doctor, and as she climbed into the back of the waiting black sedan, she didn't look back at the fortress of glass and steel where she had saved a king. She looked forward to the open road, to Harvard, and to a life that was finally, truly her own. 3 years later, the air in the main lecture hall of Johns Hopkins University smelled of floor wax and nervous anticipation, a scent that Evelyn Hartwell knew intimately, though from a very different perspective. She stood behind the podium, the microphone coal against her fingers, looking out at a sea of 200 faces, medical students, residents, and even a few gray-haired attendings who used to walk past her without a glance. She wasn't wearing the pale blue polyester uniform that scratched her skin. She was wearing a tailored white coat with Dr. Evelyn Hartwell, Harvard Medical School, embroidered in black thread over her heart. She finished her lecture on toxicological outliers, her voice steady and commanding, telling the audience that sometimes the diagnosis isn't in the blood work, but in the details that everyone else is too busy to see. As the applause broke out, a wave of validation that washed away the last lingering ghosts of the girl who used to eat lunch in the supply closet, Evelyn scanned the back of the room. There, standing in the shadows of the exit archway, was a figure that made the rest of the world fade into background noise. Julian Thorne was no longer the gray, dying invalid she had dragged back from the abyss. He was vibrant, radiating a dangerous, magnetic power in a black suit that fit him like armor. He didn't clap. He just watched her with a pride that burned brighter than the stage lights. Evelyn found him on the rooftop terrace 20 minutes later. The city of Baltimore spread out below them like a grid of glittering circuits. The wind whipped at her hair, but she didn't feel the cold. Julian was leaning against the railing, looking out at the skyline he controlled, but he turned the moment the door clicked shut. They stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of the last 3 years, the scholarship checks that arrived on time, the distant protection that kept her safe in Boston, the space he had deliberately given her, hanging between them. "You waited," Evelyn said softly, stepping closer until she could smell the expensive cologne that had once masked the scent of poison. "You could have called. You could have visited." Julian shook his head, his gray eyes softening as they traced the lines of her face. "No," he replied, his voice low and rough with suppressed emotion. "I couldn't. If I had come for you back then, you would have always wondered if you succeeded because of me, because of my money, because of my influence. I needed you to know that you built this yourself. I needed you to stand on your own 2 feet so that when you finally stood next to me, it would be as an equal." "And now?" Evelyn asked, her heart hammering against her ribs just as it had that night in the ICU, but this time from anticipation rather than fear. Julian pushed off the railing and closed the distance, his presence enveloping her like a storm. He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek with a reverence that made her knees weak. "I'm not a patient anymore, Evelyn," he whispered, his thumb brushing her skin. "And you are not a cleaner. You are the woman who looked death in the face and didn't blink. You are the only person on this earth I trust with my life." He leaned down, and when his lips met hers, it wasn't a tentative exploration. It was a claim, a seal on a contract written in blood and survival. It was the kiss of 2 people who had seen the darkest parts of humanity and chosen to find the light in each other. They walked out of the hospital together, hand in hand, leaving the ghosts of the past behind them. Evelyn Hartwell had entered those doors as an invisible servant, but she left them as a queen, ready to rule a world where science and shadows dance together. And that, dear friends, is the end of Evelyn and Julian's journey, but the echoes of their story ring true for all of us. It reminds us that your current situation is not your final destination, and that sometimes The person the world overlooks is the one holding the keys to the kingdom. We often judge people by their uniforms, their titles, or their bank accounts, but true worth is found in the courage to speak the truth when everyone else stays silent. It teaches us that betrayal can come from those closest to us, but so can salvation. Loyalty isn't about who has known you the longest. It's about who stopped the bleeding when you were wounded. Thank you so much for spending your time with Sunni Romance today. We truly hope this story touched a chord in your heart. Now, we have a question for you. Have you ever been in a situation where you saw the truth but were afraid to speak up because of your position? Or have you ever been judged by someone who didn't know your true worth? Please share your story in the comments below. We read every single one, and your experiences inspire our community. If you enjoyed this tale of vindication and love, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new story. Remember, no matter how invisible you feel today, your moment to shine is coming. Until next time, stay strong, keep believing, and never let anyone tell you that you don't matter. Goodbye.